This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to be looking at one of the most powerful mechanics in the long history of Magic, Storm. This is a mechanic that appears on spells, and when you cast a spell with Storm, a copy of that spell is made for each spell you cast before the Storm spell. This has some significant combo potential, as you might imagine. Storm originally debuted in Scourge, which came out in 2003. Considered one of the most busted mechanics ever, Storm even has a scale named after it that Mark Rosewater uses to indicate how likely it is we see a certain mechanic again. The higher the ranking, the less likely it is we'll see it on new cards. Despite the fact that Storm appears very high on its own scale, we have seen Storm reappear a few times over the years, and we did see several cards with Storm reprinted in Strixhaven's Mystical Archive, and this got me to thinking about the 10 cards with Storm that have done the most at Magic's highest level of competition. Storm decks have been viable in a multitude of formats over the years. Even though there are only 22 cards that carry this mechanic, 14 of them have at least 1 point using my scoring method, and that is an impressive rate. Alright, before we look at the 10 Storm cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Hunting Pack, a Storm spell that makes a 4/4 green beast creature token. While it is quite expensive, it is pretty nice that it's an instant, which enables you to cast it on your opponent's turn, perhaps after they have cast several spells of their own. It isn't very difficult to get at least 2 4/4 beasts out of this, and that isn't a terrible deal. Unlike a lot of the cards on this list, which mostly appear in Storm decks, as you might imagine, Hunting Pack was actually played in the sideboard of a standard ramp deck built around Mirari's Wake. The deck had no problem producing the necessary mana to cast Hunting Pack and pumped all of the tokens. Meanwhile, a lot of the decks in this format really liked casting a bunch of spells, including Blue-Green Madness and Goblins, so this could allow you to really make a bunch of 4/4s, which would actually be 5/5s with relative ease, and that was a good way of countering those decks. At number 9, it is Weather the Storm, the most recently printed Storm card. It showed up in Modern Horizons in 2019, and it also received a reprint in Strixhaven's Mystical Archive. While this might seem a bit strange, given that Storm is so high on the Storm scale, this was printed largely with the purpose of beating Storm decks, so it isn't quite as big of a violation as it might seem. Weather the Storm gains you 3 life, and with Storm, obviously it's going to gain you a lot more life than that. Weather the Storm is useful against Storm decks that try to win the game by lowering your life with a Storm spell, since they have to chain a bunch of spells together in order to kill you with their deck, and you can just use their high Storm count to your advantage and gain a ton of life, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to kill you. It's gained all of its points in Modern, and while it doesn't have any points since 2019, it seems like it could see play depending on the metagame. The Mystical Archive printing also means it's legal and historic, and if Storm decks do become a thing there, you can bet it will gain points there. At number 8, it is Dragonstorm, which is my favorite Storm card and also certainly the wackiest Storm card there is. One has to imagine that when they designed this card, they had the casual player in mind, but the fact that even a 9-mana Storm spell was easy to abuse goes a long way towards showing you how powerful this mechanic is. Like most Storm decks, Dragonstorm decks played a bunch of ritual effects like Seething Song, which could be chained together until you ended up with the necessary 9 mana to cast Dragonstorm, at which point you would automatically win the game. As long as your Storm count was at least 3, you could search up 4 Bogarden Hellkites and win the game immediately. Dragonstorm was a time-shifted card in Time Spiral block, which also has given it modern legality. While the Dragonstorm deck has never really emerged in that format, a deck that used Dragonstorm without ever intending to cast it did manage to gain a few points in the format. That deck was Blue-Red Infect, which ran the usual Infect creatures along with Blazing Shoal and Dragonstorm, which, thanks to the converted mana cost of Dragonstorm, usually meant a one-hit kill with your Infect creature. Blazing Shoal ended up getting banned out of Modern as a result, though, and Dragonstorm hasn't been relevant in the format since then. At number 7, it is Wing Shards, which makes a player sacrifice an attacking creature. Like Hunting Pack from earlier, Wing Shards was played in standard sideboards, primarily to bring in against Goblin and Reanimator decks. It was a pretty good way to stop a reanimator opponent from killing you with one big creature, and against goblins, it often made them sacrifice most of their board. At number 6, it is Mind's Desire, one of the most powerful cards in the history of the game, and also the first card where it became very clear that Storm was crazy good. In fact, Mind's Desire was so good that it is the card in Magic's history to be banned the fastest from Premier level formats. It was banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage 6 days after Scourge was released. From there, it went on to be the card featured in the very first decks that sought to win the game with Storm. These decks appeared in Extended and utilized various methods to generate a ton of mana and play a bunch of spells ahead of Mind's Desire. This would basically become the MO for Storm decks for the rest of forever. Some of these decks utilized High Tide, while others used Heartbeat of Spring and Early Harvest. By 2008, these had evolved to look more like current Storm decks, utilizing ritual effects and cantrips ahead of Mind's Desire. Vintage Storm decks also play the singleton copy of Mind's Desire they are allowed, as resolving it usually means casting your entire deck. Mind's Desire was reprinted in the Mystical Archive, and as a result, it might gain some points in Historic going forward. At number 5, it's Brain Freeze, which mills 3 of your opponent's cards. Obviously, this is the kind of Storm spell where typically, when decks cast it, they just win the game by milling an entire library. Like Mind's Desire, it first broke through in Extended decks utilizing High Tide and Heartbeat of Spring, before being played in more traditional Storm decks. Unlike Mind's Desire, though, it isn't banned in Legacy, so it has also gained a few points in Storm decks in that format too. More recently, Brain Freeze has also found its way into Vintage Underworld Breach decks, which seek to win the game with the eponymous enchantment. That deck fills the graveyard with cheap spells and then uses Underworld Breach to cast them all to create a super high Storm count. At number 4, it is Grape Shot, which does 1 damage to any target. Obviously, this is a Storm spell that can do lethal to the opponent immediately. It also is a little more flexible than some other Storm cards in that you can cast it in the earlier game if you have to, with a lower Storm count, just so you can clear the board a little bit and buy yourself some time. It has been featured in Storm decks in Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. It was also reprinted in the Strixhaven Mystical Archive, and it may be the Storm card that will be the easiest to abuse in Historic, simply because it only costs 2 mana, and the others cost considerably more. At number 3, it is Empty the Warrens, which makes 2 1/1 Goblin creature tokens. At first glance, it might seem that using Empty the Warrens to win the game isn't nearly as good as going with Grape Shot or Brain Freeze. After all, you don't have to wait a turn to attack with those. And, well, you're right. In most ways, those cards are better as Storm win conditions, in the sense that you tend to win the moment you cast them with a high enough Storm count. However, Empty the Warrens has a few upsides over those types of cards. First, you can cast it earlier with a smaller Storm count and win over a few turns, and second, it gets around cards that give a player hexproof. Grape Shot and Brain Freeze can't do anything if someone has hexproof, but Empty the Warrens can. As a result, it has been played in Storm decks in Modern, Extended, Legacy, and Vintage. At number 2, it is Tendrils of Agony, a Storm spell that drains 2 life. Like with most Storm cards, the idea here is to play a bunch of cheap cantrips and rituals, and then use Tendrils of Agony to do lethal on the spot. Tendrils needs a much lower Storm count to kill an opponent than Brain Freeze or Grape Shot do. It needs a Storm count of 9 or less in most cases, at which point it is lethal. It's the most played of all Storm deck win conditions. Over the years, it has put up points in Extended, Legacy, and Vintage, and it's going to continue to gain points in both Eternal formats. Like Weather the Storm, Grape Shot, and Mind's Desire, Tendrils of Agony was reprinted in the Mystical Archive, and that could mean it will gain points in Historic in the future. And at number 1, by a lot, it's Flusterstorm. This is another fairly recent Storm card. It was printed in 2011, but like Weather the Storm, one of its primary purposes is being able to counter Storm decks. You see, one of the things that makes Storm decks so good is that you normally can't counter every single copy that is made. You need a separate counterspell for each one, but Flusterstorm helps you get around that, since it has Storm itself. The reason it has such an absurdly high score is because it is played in just about every single sideboard in both Legacy and Vintage, since Storm decks are a major force in both formats. It was also reprinted in Modern Horizons, and while that hasn't translated to points in that format yet, you can bet that if Storm decks show up in that format, Flusterstorm will start gaining points there too. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you're looking to buy these cards for your Storm deck, you can get them at Card Kingdom. In the description, you can find a direct link for each of the cards that appeared in this video. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on the over 350 MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Finally, if you like hearing me talk about Magic, you might also enjoy hearing me talk about history. That's something I do over on my other channel, Need to Hone History, which you should see a link to on your screen now. Thanks for watching.